Riga, January 1942. Dawn broke over the frozen city like a muted explosion, pale light spreading across rooftops coated in frost, chimneys exhaling ribbons of gray smoke. The streets were nearly empty, except for patrols whose boots left neat, disciplined trails in the snow. Elias Brandt stepped out of the barracks with a hollow feeling in his chest, the kind that comes after a night without real sleep. The events inside Section 4 clung to him like invisible dust. The stamped papers, the muffled voices, the quiet efficiency of irreversible decisions. He tried to clear his mind, but the cold air only sharpened it. At headquarters, officers filed in and out carrying maps, requisition forms, interception logs. Everyone looked busy. Everyone looked tired. But their exhaustion was the routine kind, the exhaustion of men who believed in the necessity of their tasks. Elias forced himself into that rhythm as he crossed the main corridor. A messenger intercepted him. "Brandt, you're wanted in the radio office." He followed the soldier through a series of narrow hallways that smelled of damp wool and overheated stoves. Inside the radio room, static cracked like distant gunfire. Operators sat at their consoles, headphones pressed tight, scribbling coded transmissions. Hauptmann Hallen stood beside one operator, listening intently. The moment Elias entered, Hallen gestured him over. "Intercept from the Daugavpils perimeter," Hallen said. "You should hear this." The operator replayed the message, a captured partisan transmission, fragmented and distorted. But the key phrase was clear. Movement at Depot 12. Files transferred, names taken. Hallen folded his arms. "It seems the locals know more than we thought." Elias felt his stomach tighten. The Depot-S secrecy was supposed to be absolute. If resistance groups had identified it even partially, the entire system was at risk. "Sir," Elias said, "is it possible our transport routes were compromised?" Hallen shook his head slowly. "Everything leaks in the east. Fear, hunger, desperation, they loosened tongues. But this worries me." He tapped the intercepted message. Names taken. Someone saw the classifications, or heard about them. A chill ran through Elias. What should I do? Hallen handed him a file thicker than the others he'd received, bound with twine. "You will review every personnel movement at the depot from the past 3 weeks. Every list, every transport, every officer who signed off on them. If someone talked or allowed something to be seen, I want to know who. It was a test, another one, and failure didn't mean reassignment. It meant ruin." Elias nodded. "Yes, sir." He carried the file back to an empty records room and shut the door behind him. Dust floated in the air. A single lamp illuminated the desk. He unbound the twine and opened the file. Rows of names again. Dates, transfer orders, confirmations, stamps. But this time, he was looking for mistakes, anything that could hint at a breach. As he moved through the pages, he noticed something strange. A series of transports from a nearby village had been processed unusually fast, too fast. The officer signatures were neat, almost rehearsed, and the coding symbols beside the names were identical, as if copied. One signature appeared repeatedly, Oberfeldwebel R. Mertens. Elias remembered the name, a logistics officer who handled paperwork with an almost smug confidence. The door to the records room creaked open. Mertens himself stood there. "Working late?" he asked, smiling faintly. Elias closed the file halfway, masking the page he'd been studying. "Just reviewing procedural logs." Mertens stepped inside, his boots leaving snow prints across the floor. "Procedures," he said, leaning casually against a cabinet, are only as important as the men who write them. Elias studied his face, the relaxed posture, the hands behind the back, the smile that didn't reach the eyes. "What are you doing here?" Elias asked. Mertens shrugged. "Checking on my paperwork. Hallen said you might be reviewing transport lists." Elias kept his tone neutral. "Nothing unusual so far." Mertens' smile widened. "Good. The fewer complications, the better for everyone." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Brandt," he said softly, "some advice. You're new here. Don't get lost in unnecessary details. This is the East. Things move fast." Elias waited until Mertens left before he exhaled. Unnecessary details. The words echoed in his mind. But if those details reached resistance groups, or foreign intelligence networks, or even rival German divisions, they could ignite something far larger. He reopened the file. Mertens' S signatures appeared again and again on lists of families removed from villages, on orders for rapid classification, on documents with suspiciously uniform markings. Then Elias found the anomaly. A manifest signed by Mertens, dated 2 days earlier, for a transport that had never arrived at the depot. No record, no confirmation, nothing. It had vanished. Either Mertens misreported a transport, or he falsified documents to cover something far more dangerous. Elias stared at the page. Outside, the cold wind whistled through the cracks in the windows. The depot lights flickered. For the first time since arriving in Riga, Elias felt it clearly. He was no longer simply witnessing the machinery of war. He was now caught inside its gears. And those gears were beginning to turn against each other, London, Paris, Berlin, late 1938 into early 1939. Europe was now a house whose beams had already cracked. The structure still stood, but anyone listening closely could hear the slow, rhythmic groaning before collapse. The year opened with diplomats still shuttling between capitals, still drafting memoranda, still shaking hands in cold hallways, yet none of them could admit that diplomacy itself was dying. The illusion of peace. After Munich, the Munich Agreement had been sold to the public as peace saved, a miracle, negotiated at the very edge of catastrophe. But within government ministries, a different feeling spread. Embarrassment, then dread. British and French intelligence officers quietly reported that Germany had increased its military production even while negotiating, that the Wehrmacht had been preparing for further expansion, not coexistence. In Prague, Czechoslovakia's leaders knew the truth before anyone else. Munich wasn't the end, it was the beginning of the end. They had lost the Sudetenland fortifications, lost the mountainous shield that once made invasion costly, lost their industrial backbone, and lost the trust of their allies. Inside the shattered remnants of the government, a single question circulated. How long until Berlin returns? For the rest? The answer arrived on March 15, 1939, when German troops marched into Prague without firing a shot. Diplomacy had not failed. It had been used, bent, and weaponized. Hitler as confidence and the West as awakening. For the first time, London and Paris understood the mistake. Munich hadn't bought peace. It had been appeasement at a discount, and Hitler learned the exact lesson he needed. Europe would yield if pressured hard enough. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who months earlier had waved his famous paper promising peace for our time, now faced a parliament increasingly hostile to compromise. The British public, usually slow to anger, now felt humiliated. Germany had crossed a line not protected by ethnic pretext. There was no German minority in Prague to justify annexation. This was outright domination. In Paris, the French government faced the same realization, but with deeper fear. Their intelligence services reported German troop movements along the Rhine at a pace that suggested momentum, not caution. The French High Command, still haunted by World War I's scars, dreaded another conflict, yet recognized its inevitability. Thus, a decisive shift occurred. Britain issued formal guarantees to Poland. France approved every rearmament program requested by its generals. Diplomacy did not end, but it changed from negotiation to deterrence. Poland, under the crosshairs, Warsaw became the new center of Europe's storm. Caught between two predatory powers, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, Poland hoped the British and French promises would be enough to scare Berlin. But the Poles understood German intentions even before the West did. Hitler's demands for the return of Danzig and a corridor to East Prussia were presented as reasonable, but Polish Foreign Minister Joseph Beck saw through them. He famously stated, "There is only one thing that cannot be negotiated honor." Poland refused. Hitler smiled. Inside the Wilhelmstrasse, his diplomats received new orders. Negotiation would continue, but solely for appearance. Intelligence intercepted by the British revealed that Germany had already drafted military action plans. The Soviet factor Europe's final blind spot. While the West obsessed over Berlin, Stalin watched from Moscow with cold calculation. He had no desire to be dragged into another conflict for Poland's sake, and he certainly had no trust in Britain or France. Their hesitation during talks with the USSR showed one thing: the West feared communism more than Nazism. Stalin had no illusions. He waited, he watched, and he prepared his own move, the one that would shock the world. The collapse of diplomacy. By mid-1939, Europe's diplomatic calendar was still full. Envoys met, ministers exchanged notes, telegraphs flew across borders, but the substance had vanished. Germany negotiated with Poland while planning its invasion. Britain negotiated with the USSR while doubting its intentions. France negotiated rearmament schedules while its government crumbled internally. The USSR negotiated with both sides, waiting for the one fatal misstep. The international system built so painstakingly after 1918 was now an empty shell. What remained was only time, and not much of it. The point of no return. By the final weeks before war, even the diplomats themselves sensed the end. In Berlin, British Ambassador Sir Neville Henderson left meetings pale-faced, knowing he was speaking to a man who no longer believed in peace. In Paris, generals whispered that the next mobilization order would not be a drill. Europe had stepped onto a road that offered no exit. The fragile balance that survived 20 years had shattered. What came next would be the most devastating conflict in human history. Moscow, August 1939. In the suffocating heat of late summer, diplomats from three great powers circled one another like predators forced into the same cage. Britain, France, and the Soviet Union held high-level talks that were meant to stop Hitler's expansion. On paper, it looked like the last hope to prevent war. In reality, it was already too late. The West arrives too late and too slowly. The British delegation that arrived in Moscow shocked even their own supporters. Instead of senior statesmen, London sent low-ranking negotiators without authority to make binding decisions. Worse, they traveled by slow merchant ship rather than airplane taking days to arrive. Stalin watched this with icy amusement. If Britain and France were truly desperate to stop Germany, why send amateurs? Why travel at the speed of the 19th century when Europe was minutes from catastrophe? In meetings, the Western powers insisted the USSR join a three-way alliance. But when it came to details, troop rights, borders, guarantees, they hesitated. Poland refused to let Soviet troops enter its territory even for defense, fearing that Moscow's help would become occupation. To Stalin, the message was unmistakable. The West wanted Soviet soldiers, but not Soviet power. Hitler's sudden proposal. Just as the negotiations stalled, a secret message arrived in Moscow from Berlin. The tone was surprisingly polite, almost flattering. Hitler offered the Soviet Union something Britain and France never would, a guarantee that both empires would stay out of each other's way. A division of Eastern Europe, economic cooperation, and most importantly, time. To Stalin, the offer was pure realpolitik. Germany was preparing for war with Poland. France and Britain would respond. But Germany wanted to avoid a two-front war, and Stalin, he wanted to avoid a war entirely, at least until the Red Army was rebuilt from the purges of 1937-38. Hitler's message ended with a single line that shook the world. The future of Europe depends on the understanding of our two nations. The night the world shifted, August 23, 1939. In the late hours of August 23rd, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop arrived in Moscow. Red carpets were rolled out. Cameras flashed. The world's newspapers printed the photographs only hours later. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, bitter ideological enemies, were shaking hands. Behind closed doors, Stalin smiled more than anyone expected. He offered vodka, he toasted to Hitler, and he signed a document that would seal millions of fates, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. A secret protocol divided Eastern Europe between the two dictatorships. Poland split down the middle. The Baltic states assigned to the USSR, Finland placed within Soviet-influenced Bessarabia to be taken from Romania. Ribbentrop could barely hide his excitement. Stalin remained calm, but inside he already knew. He had bought the Soviet Union one thing above all time to rebuild. Reaction in Europe: shock, betrayal, and silence. When the pact became public, European capitals reacted with disbelief. In Berlin, Hitler was euphoric. No Soviet interference meant one thing: the Polish campaign could proceed immediately. In London, Chamberlain nearly collapsed at the news. His entire strategy balancing Germany with Soviet help was now dead. In Paris, French ministers cursed openly in Parliament. They had assumed ideology alone would keep the Soviets aligned with the West. They were wrong. In Warsaw, panic spread. Poland was now isolated, surrounded from both sides, with alliances that would not deliver immediate military aid. For ordinary Europeans, the pact felt like the final confirmation that diplomacy, the world's safeguard since 1918, had collapsed entirely. The countdown begins. In the final days of August, the world held its breath. On August 25th, Germany prepared to invade Poland. Orders were printed. Units moved to the border. Engines warmed. But at the last second, Hitler hesitated. He wanted every part of the political stage set perfectly. Diplomats scrambled one last time. Ultimatums were issued, proposals exchanged, threats shouted across borders. But everyone knew the truth. The last negotiation had already been signed in Moscow. All that remained was the moment guns opened fire and the world slid into the deadliest conflict in human history.